Hi, I'm Nisa Brown, somatic counselor and craniosacral bodyworker. And in this video, I am going to be talking about somatic therapy and how it is effective for trauma integration or trauma healing, attachment repatterning, and nervous system regulation. So first, I just want to talk a little bit about what somatic therapy even is and what makes it different than traditional talk therapy. So in traditional talk therapy, there's more of an emphasis on understanding the patterns or the problems going on in someone's life, and oftentimes linking that back to childhood or earlier experiences and kind of making some sense over how these patterns came to be. And that can be very, very helpful, and it can be effective for creating change. But many times, people come to a point in their journey with talk therapy where they've developed a high level of understanding about their patterns and where their patterns come from, but not necessarily experiencing the type of change that they're looking for. And that might be that in their life, a person might be having continual reactions or responses to their relationships or to outside circumstances that don't really match the situation, and they may understand where that's coming from. For example, someone maybe had a childhood history of a erratic parent, and they were very afraid of their parent, and they developed a pattern of kind of hiding or walking on eggshells and being afraid to speak. And that might be coming out in their adult relationships. But understanding that might not really create much change. And so somatic therapy, it takes a bit of a different approach. Whereas when I'm sitting with a client, I am listening and understanding, and there's some concept of meaning making happening about these patterns. But I'm actually becoming more curious and helping the client become curious about what the body is actually telling about these experiences. So, what is actually happening in the body in those moments when that client I gave as an example might be going into that type of a freeze state or a shutdown or a fear response. And through exploring what's happening in the body, that can help bring up to the surface the body memory from the childhood. So, why is body memory a helpful way of working with these patterns? So, when we're young, then we're actually storing all of our memory in our body because our brain hasn't actually developed the parts of the brain center, the parts of the brain where meaning making happens, which is in the prefrontal cortex. And so all of these memories are stored in the primitive parts of the brain, and they continue to show up in these body responses. And we might use the term, being triggered when someone is having an interaction and they're suddenly feeling really strong sensations in the body. That would be having a body memory. And now, after the brain is fully developed, when someone goes through an experience that is traumatic, meaning that they were experiencing it as a high level of threat, then the brain just decides to bypass that meaning-making part of the brain and send that memory straight through up to the amygdala and store it in that subcortical primitive part of the brain because it's associated with threat. And so then when we're encountering anything that kind of reminds us of that experience, then we're again having these body responses. And so when we say trauma's in the body, we're really just saying that the body is continuing to have these responses as if that event is happening now. And so when we're bringing these memories up by the body memory itself, not just the cognitive memory, but kind of, wow, what's happening in the body when you're having that response, then we're able to bring it to the surface to where neuroplasticity can happen. And then I'm supporting the client to be able to experience those body memories with another safe, regulated, present adult. And as their regulated adult is online, and that allows that memory, that body memory, to be run through the meaning-making center in the brain and stored differently. And that can allow for it to become integrated and that those responses aren't continuing to happen. And so I named it, one of my specialties is attachment repatterning. So our attachment system meaning how we are in relationship to connection. That is all formed by the time we're about 18 months old. And that patterning starts even while we're in utero. And we're having hundreds of experiences every day in the first 18 months of life that are really shaping how we're taking in connection and how safe we feel and what our expectations are. And these aren't expectations that we have developed cognitively, but they're expectations that are kind of just what we inherently believe connection will be. And so we may find ourselves as adults in a different situation, maybe a very safe relationship situation, but we're going to continue to go back in time, and our body's going to continue to tell the story of that earlier period of time where all of those beliefs were stored and kind of stuck in that first initial setup when we were developing our attachment system. If you don't know much about attachment theory, I will talk about that in another video, but that's just referring to what we call the different attachment styles, which are secure attachment, anxious ambivalent attachment, avoidant attachment, and disorganized or fearful avoidant. And that's really talking about the attachment adaptations are going to manifest as someone being kind of overly focused on the external relationships, or kind of avoiding or afraid of connecting, or a combination of the two. And so as I'm working with a client, then I'm supporting them to kind of become curious about the body. And also I'm listening to the story that their body and their dialogue is telling about their attachment experiences, and supporting again the client to bring to the surface these kind of immediate responses that are stored in the body around connection. And from there, we can again create what's called memory reconsolidation, where we can start to actually shift the patterning in the brain that's associated with these attachment experiences. And so it's much more effective than just understanding. Just understanding what's happening in the attachment system can help us override and change how we're showing up in relationship, but changing the way that these immediate responses are even stored can also be in some ways a deeper, more direct way of really getting to the root and the heart of the matter. So now I want to talk about, nervous system regulation. So as I'm supporting a client, I am also starting to understand what is happening in their nervous system. And the goal of somatic therapy, effective somatic trauma-based therapy, is going to be to help a client have more resilience to stress and more nervous system flexibility. So we're all going to go through moments of overwhelm, but that when we went through chronic overwhelming experiences early on, our nervous system can develop pathways where we can get stuck constantly in a state of fight, flight, or freeze, or even a combination of fight, flight, and freeze. And so I'm supporting the nervous system to be able to come in and out of overwhelm and calming down. We call this activation and deactivation cycles. And I'm over time, then the client's system just starts to learn how to do that on their own and doesn't need me as much, but I'm kind of supporting that flexibility to develop so that someone can raise their regulatory capacity, increase their capacity for self-regulation. And through supporting the trauma resolution and the attachment patterning, that's also a way of increasing nervous system flexibility. And so one of the things that people often are surprised by when I'm working with them and we're first kind of discussing what they might expect in somatic therapy is that I actually don't really need to know any of the details of someone's trauma history to do very effective trauma therapy. A client may be kind of remembering and to some degree, I wouldn't say re-experiencing, but touching into some of these memories, but we're not really going into that. The more that I'm supporting them to increase nervous system flexibility, the more that's healing the effects of trauma alone, because the effects of trauma was the nervous system getting stuck in the threat responses. And there are times where I am supporting a client to discharge, we call it, to move through some of the ways that the body is kind of having a tension or holding pattern from a traumatic memory or a past traumatic event, or kind of maybe touching in slightly to some of the early experiences that created the attachment patterns. But I'm not asking a lot of questions about the trauma history. I actually ask nothing going into my sessions. And the emphasis is much more on how to create more of an experience of the way that we want to feel in the present moment. And as the places that are stuck come to the surface, then I'm supporting those to become resolved so that we can spend more and more time in a regulated, safe, easeful present day experience. And so even though the form of somatic therapy I'm offering, and many of us somatic practitioners are offering, is centered around trauma, it is generally focusing less and less and less on trauma as the person's system is able to come out of trauma. We're not going into trauma. The goal is to come out of it. And so it's generally very gentle. It can be very fun. It's very relational. And even though it's touching into the body, it's generally helping someone become more comfortable in the body and allowing the body to become more of a safe place. So I have never experienced a client having re-traumatization from this work, and it's often very gentle and enjoyable, and it's very effective for shifting those deep-seated patterns, for creating new attachment pathways, resolving trauma, and creating a more flexible nervous system. So I encourage you to check it out and let me know if you have any questions.